Welcome, dear listener, to Family Shadows. This is a place where stories about fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters unfold. Stories not always told at the dinner table, but ones that echo in the silence afterward. If you find meaning here, if these stories remind you of someone you've loved or someone you've lost, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe, share, let these stories live a little longer. Tonight's story is titled, "They Mocked My Accent at the Family Dinner, so I spoke in numbers they couldn't ignore." This is Chapter 1, The Silent Craftsman. If you had driven down Maple Street in a small Midwestern town, just a block away from the high school where Friday night football echoed across the bleachers, you might have missed the workshop. It sat quiet, tucked behind a chain-link fence, its brick walls stained with decades of sawdust and rain. But if you had gone inside, if you had pushed open the heavy wooden door, you would have seen something remarkable. You would have seen rows of wooden chairs, their backs curved like they were waiting to hold generations of weary spines. You would have smelled the pine, sharp and clean, mixed with the musk of old varnish. You would have heard the rasp of sandpaper and the slow hum of a man at work. That man was Daniel Tran. Daniel had come to America more than 40 years ago with nothing but a small suitcase, a photo of his late father folded into his wallet, and a stubborn hope that hard work could turn into love for his children. His English was clumsy back then, tangled with tones from a faraway country. Even after decades, the accent never left him. It clung to his syllables like sawdust on a workbench. People heard it before they heard him. At the grocery store, when he asked for directions to the flour, the young clerk would smirk, pretending not to understand. At the bank, when he signed loan papers, he could see the impatience in the teller's eyes as he repeated himself twice, sometimes 3 times. And at home sometimes, when his son David was still a teenager, the boy would roll his eyes and answer him in clipped phrases, as if to remind him that words with the wrong rhythm carried less weight in this country. But Daniel never raised his voice. He raised his hands instead into the grain of wood, into the labor of nights and weekends, into the calluses that fed his children. The workshop was where Daniel was fluent. There, his accent disappeared. The curve of a chair leg, the smooth polish of a table's surface. These were sentences he could speak without faltering. And it was with these hands that he built his family's foundation. David, his eldest, had not always been ungrateful. As a boy, David would sit on a stool in the workshop, legs dangling, watching his father turn blocks of wood into something almost alive. Daniel would hand him scraps, teach him to sand, to listen to the sound of smoothness. David would laugh when his father made a toy horse, carving the mane with quick strokes. But children grow, and America has its way of reshaping ambition. By the time David went to college, paid for by countless tables and cabinets sold from that small shop, he began to see his father less as a craftsman and more as a man who had failed to climb higher. David wanted suits, titles, dinner parties with wine that needed to breathe before you drank it. He wanted, as he once muttered under his breath, something more than wood and nails. Daniel had heard him, though David didn't know. The house Daniel lived in now was modest, a 2-bedroom with a garage that held more tools than cars. On the mantel sat a single-framed photo, his late wife, Anna, smiling on their wedding day, her hair pinned up with delicate care. She had been the bridge between Daniel and the world. When she was alive, her voice softened his accent, repeating his words gently so others would understand. She made his English less lonely. When she passed away, Mark, his grandson, was barely 5 then. Daniel's silence grew heavier. But he carried on as he always had. His son had a new life to build, a new family with Emily. Daniel thought of himself as the supporting beam hidden in the walls, unseen, uncelebrated, but holding everything steady. He paid the last semester of David's tuition without telling him. He helped with the down payment on the house David and Emily bought in the suburbs. He covered the hospital bill when Mark had pneumonia one winter. He did it all quietly, not because he wanted gratitude, but because it was what fathers did. And yet, gratitude never came. One Thursday evening, while oiling the hinges of a rocking chair he had just finished, Daniel received a call. It was David. "Dad," David said, voice brisk, "we're having dinner Saturday night. Emily's parents will be there. It's kind of a big deal, first time the families get together since the wedding. You'll come, right?" Daniel smiled, though David couldn't see it. "Of course, I bring something." His accent curled around the words. No, David said quickly. Just come, and wear something nice, okay?" Daniel glanced down at his work shirt, sleeves rolled up, buttons frayed from years of use. "Yes, I wear nice." After the call, Daniel sat in the quiet workshop a long while. He rubbed the handle of the rocking chair, thinking of Anna. She would have baked something sweet to bring, something to soften the edges of the night. Without her, all he had was wood and silence. Still, he would go. He always showed up for his son. Saturday came crisp and cool, the kind of autumn evening when the air smelled faintly of burning leaves. Daniel wore his best jacket, navy blue, though the lining was thinning. He polished his shoes until they caught the porch light, then drove his old sedan across town. The car groaned but carried him faithfully, as it had for years. When he arrived at David's house, the driveway was already filled with newer cars, sleek, polished, whispering of salaries and promotions. Daniel parked at the curb, adjusted his collar, and walked to the door. Mark answered first. His teenage grin flashed, and for a moment Daniel felt the warmth of recognition. "Grandpa, you made it." Daniel's smile deepened. "Of course. Always come." Behind Mark, Daniel caught a glimpse of Emily's parents, Richard and Susan Miller, seated in the living room. Their posture was perfect, their laughter sharp and practiced. David hovered near them, pouring wine, his tie knotted just so. "Dad," David said when he noticed him. "Good you're here." His tone was polite, but Daniel caught the quick flicker of his son's eyes, scanning his jacket, his shoes, his posture, as if measuring whether he fit into the picture. Dinner began. At first, the conversation was harmless. The weather, the local football team, Emily's promotion at work. Daniel listened quietly, nodding, smiling when addressed. He spoke only when spoken to, his words careful, accented, but then came the first remark. "So, Mr. Tran," Richard said, swirling his glass, "David tells us you have a shop, carpentry." "Yes," Daniel replied, his consonants clipped, his vowels stretched. "Wood shop, I build furniture." Susan tilted her head, lips curved just so. "Oh, how quaint." David chuckled nervously, shifting in his seat. Emily avoided her father-in-law's eyes, and Daniel, ever the craftsman, sat silent, his hands folded in his lap. That was how it began, the whispers of shame. Daniel's silence at the table might have passed unnoticed, but the truth was everyone noticed. Silence has its own sound, after all. It hangs in the air like a heavy coat draped over the shoulders of a man who doesn't deserve its weight. David cleared his throat quickly, rushing to fill the gap. "Dad's shop has been around forever," he said, almost too brightly. "He's very dedicated." "Dedicated," Susan echoed, as if testing the word in her mouth. "That's admirable." She sipped her wine, and Daniel wondered why admiration felt so much like pity when spoken in her accent. He didn't answer. He reached for the bread basket, broke a piece, and chewed slowly. The crust was tougher than Anna's bread had been. Anna used to bake bread that almost melted when you touched it. He thought of her hands dusted in flour, her smile as she wiped her palms on her apron. For a moment, Daniel felt her absence more sharply than usual, like a fresh wound pressed by accident. "Dad, could you pass the butter?" David asked, his voice taut, his smile still fixed at his in-laws. Daniel did as he was told. The dinner stretched on with its polite cruelty. Each comment, each laugh was a chisel stroke, carving Daniel into something smaller. He said little, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew words could be twisted. He had learned that long ago, in factory break rooms, in school conferences, in bank offices where his accent was treated like a flaw in the wood. What could he say, really, to people who measured worth by smoothness of vowels instead of the steadiness of hands? And yet, in that quiet, something else began to stir in him. A calculation, almost. Numbers he had carried for years, stacked neatly in ledgers, written in the language of survival. Tuition payments, mortgage checks, medical bills, the invisible arithmetic of a father's devotion. Mark was the only one who looked at him differently. Across the table, the boy caught his grandfather's eye. Daniel gave him the faintest nod, and Mark, without knowing why, felt his chest swell with both pride and shame. He wanted to speak up, to tell his parents to stop hiding behind laughter. But he was 14, and 14 is an age of silence, too. The rest of the night blurred. Dishes were cleared, wine refilled, jokes shared at his expense. Daniel remained steady, a man carved of oak, letting the ridicule pass over him. But inside, the quiet revenge was beginning to take shape. When the evening ended, Daniel stood, thanked Emily for the meal, and embraced his grandson. David walked him to the door the way a polite son should, but his words were rehearsed, brittle. "Dad, thanks for coming. You know how it is, right? Different families, different expectations." Daniel looked at him. The porch light cast shadows across his son's face, the same face Anna had once kissed goodnight 1,000 times. "I know," Daniel said softly, his accent wrapping around the words. "I know very well." He placed a hand on David's shoulder, firm but gentle. "Someday you understand me, not how I say, but what I do." David gave a quick, nervous laugh. "Yeah, sure, good night, Dad," and with that the door closed. The ride home was quiet, the hum of the old sedan steady against the dark streets. Daniel's thoughts returned to his workshop, to the ledgers, to the long years of numbers that spoke louder than his voice ever could. He began to plan. The Millers prided themselves on conversation. At least that was how they saw it. To them, talk was currency. Every word was a way to announce where you had been, who you knew, what you owned. Their sentences sparkled with self-assurance, the kind that came from never doubting if others could understand you. Daniel listened. He had always been a good listener. But here, every syllable he spoke seemed to fall into a well and echo back with a smirk. "So, David tells us you built your own business," Richard Miller said, resting his elbows on the table like a man settling in for sport. "That must be quaint, but hard to scale, isn't it? Furniture's a tough market. Lots of competition. Cheap imports, you know." Daniel took a breath before answering. "Yes, hard market, but people always need table, chair, something solid, something last long." His words landed clumsy like a chair missing a leg. Richard's lips twitched. Susan raised her brows. "Solid," she repeated, her tone syrupy. "That's a nice way of putting it." David quickly interjected, "Dad's shop has been doing fine, Mom. It's just different." Different. The word hung there heavier than insult. Different was the polite way of saying not enough. The conversation shifted, but the undercurrent remained. Susan launched into a story about her family's trips to Europe, the fine dining, the language lessons. Emily laughed dutifully. David kept pouring wine, trying to keep the laughter flowing faster than the discomfort. Daniel's hands rested in his lap. He had sanded thousands of chair legs smoother than this moment. He had carved wood that splintered less than these words, and yet he remained still. Then came the whisper. Mark, still chewing his food, overheard it before Daniel did. Susan leaned toward Richard, her voice lowered but not enough. "It's a shame," she murmured. "Such a thick accent, you'd think after all these years." Richard chuckled. "Well, some things you can't sand smooth, dear." Mark froze, his fork hung midair. He looked at his grandfather, who sat just a few feet away, still eating his bread as though nothing had been said. Did he hear? Did he not? Daniel had heard. He always heard. He broke another piece of bread, dipped it in the butter, and lifted it to his lips. His face betrayed nothing, but his silence deepened. The laughter at the other end of the table grew. Someone, Mark couldn't even remember who, made a joke about old-world habits, and another voice chimed in, "Careful, or he'll start building us chairs right here at the table." More laughter. David laughed, too. Nervously, half-heartedly, but he laughed. That sound cut deeper than the jokes themselves. Daniel looked at his son. For just a flicker, their eyes met. David looked away first. Mark felt something in him stir. Anger, maybe, or shame. He wanted to shout, "Stop it, that's my grandfather." But the words clung to his throat, afraid to break the fragile order of adults. 14-year-olds learn quickly how silence is expected of them. Daniel, however, knew silence not as submission but as strategy. He chewed slowly, breathing evenly, and let the shame swirl around the table like smoke. Let them believe he was small. Let them think his accent made him weak. Because he knew, though no one else yet understood, that there were other languages. Languages that needed no vowels or consonants. Languages written in numbers, in balances and ledgers, in checks cleared and debts forgiven. And when the time came, he would speak in that language. For now, he let the whispers of shame echo unanswered. The dinner plates had been cleared and replaced with roasted lamb. Its scent drifting warm and heavy through the room. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier, refracting it into sharp little shards across the tablecloth. Forks and knives clinked against porcelain, the rhythm of polite dining. But beneath the surface of small talk, Daniel felt the undercurrent tightening. The Millers had grown comfortable in their laughter, emboldened by wine and each other's company. They no longer whispered when they spoke of him. It began with Susan, her tone playful, though her words carried an edge. "So, Daniel," she said, elongating his name like she was testing its weight, "do you ever find it difficult? Running a business here, I mean, with the language barrier." The table chuckled softly. David forced a smile, glancing at his wife as though begging her to steer the conversation elsewhere. Emily looked away, embarrassed, but said nothing. Daniel set down his fork. He lifted his glass, drank slowly, then placed it back with careful precision. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But would it not need many words? You touch, you feel, it tell you what it need." For a moment the table quieted. His answer was gentle, but it carried weight. Mark almost smiled, but then Richard leaned back, smirking. "Well, maybe Wood listens better than we do," Richard said. "Because honestly, half the time I can't make out a word you say." The laughter that followed was louder this time. Not a murmur, not an awkward cough disguised as a laugh, but a chorus, open and cruel. David joined in. His laugh was thinner than the others, but it was there. Daniel looked at his son. His face remained calm, but inside, something pressed hard against his ribs, an ache older than the walls of this house. He remembered nights when David was small, when the boy would run into his arms after a nightmare. He remembered holding him close, whispering comfort in the very accent his son now allowed others to ridicule. The cutting words landed deeper than the laugh itself, not in the mouth of Richard Miller, but in the silence of David Tran. "Dad," David said quickly, trying to smooth things over. "They're just joking around. Don't take it personally." Daniel smiled faintly. "Joke," he repeated, his accent stretched the vowel. "Yes, a joke." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He glanced at his grandfather's face, calm, too calm. He wanted to say something, but his tongue was locked behind fear. Susan added her piece, almost as if she wanted the last nail hammered in. "You know," she said sweetly, "Emily once told me how hard it was for her introducing you at the wedding. She worried people wouldn't understand the speech." David coughed into his napkin, but it was too late. The words had already been spoken. Daniel's hand tightened around his fork, the metal cold against his skin. He thought of Anna again. She would have softened this moment, would have spoken with grace on his behalf. Without her, he felt the loneliness of being a man outnumbered, outvoiced. But he did not break. He did not shout. Instead, he lifted a small bite of lamb to his mouth, chewed slowly and swallowed. His silence was his shield. Let them think he was weak. Let them think the accent made him less. Because while they measured words, he measured lives. His son's tuition, his family's home, his grandson's health. And those numbers, etched in ledgers and memory, waited quietly for their turn to speak. The cutting words had been delivered. But Daniel, the silent craftsman, was already shaping his reply. One not made of syllables, but of truth too heavy to ignore. The room had settled back into its rhythm after the laughter, as though nothing remarkable had happened. Plates scraped softly. Wine was refilled. The chandelier hummed faintly, its light spilling gold over porcelain and silverware. But Mark couldn't move past it. The words, the laughter, they clung to him like smoke in his lungs. He kept stealing glances at his grandfather, waiting to see some crack in his composure. Daniel sat tall, his back straight, his hands steady on the table. He wasn't slumped, wasn't defeated. His eyes, dark and deliberate, moved slowly from one face to the next, as though he were measuring each person against something unseen. Mark had seen those eyes before. When he was younger, visiting the workshop, he had watched his grandfather stare at a piece of wood for minutes before making a single cut. He once asked why. Daniel had smiled and said, "Wood, like people, it tell you who it is. If you cut too fast, you ruin it. You must wait, you must see." Tonight, Mark realized his grandfather was looking at this table the same way, quietly studying, waiting, letting the truth reveal itself. The Millers carried on. Susan boasted about a charity gala, Richard about his golf handicap. Emily laughed in all the right places. David, tense but eager, chimed in with stories of his latest project at work. Daniel nodded, listening. His silence, however, was no longer passive. It was intentional, like the pause between hammer strikes. He let their words fall one after another, stacking into a tower of arrogance. He would not knock it down yet, but he saw how high it was climbing. Mark leaned back in his chair, his young mind caught between confusion and awe. Was his grandfather hurt, angry, ashamed? None of those seemed quite right. There was something else, something harder to name, a quiet strength that didn't need rescuing. The boy lowered his eyes to his plate, cheeks burning with a shame that wasn't even his to carry. He wanted to tell his parents, "Don't you see what you're doing?" But he also knew they wouldn't hear it. Not tonight. Daniel reached for his glass again. His hand trembled only slightly as he lifted it, and in that small tremor Mark thought he saw all the years of labor behind it. The heavy beams carried alone, the long nights spent bending wood, the hundreds of meals skipped so bills could be paid on time. Daniel's eyes caught his grandson's across the table, just for a second, and in that second Mark understood something that would stay with him for years. His grandfather's silence wasn't weakness, it was patience. The kind of patience only a man could learn after 4 decades of being underestimated, dismissed, laughed at, and surviving anyway. The clatter of cutlery and the hum of shallow conversation blurred into background noise. Mark kept staring, wide-eyed, at the man who seemed to carry an entire history inside his gaze. Daniel blinked once, slowly, as if to tell the boy, "I see you, and I know you see me." And for the first time that evening, Mark felt a kind of pride swell in his chest, pride that didn't belong to his father or his polished grandparents or even the beautiful house around them. It belonged to the man at the table who said almost nothing and yet seemed to speak the loudest. Daniel turned back to his plate, tore another piece of bread, dipped it into the lamb's juices, and ate in silence. The table thought the moment had passed, but Mark knew better. His grandfather's quiet eyes had already begun writing a reply, one they weren't prepared to read. The clinking of silverware slowed as dessert was brought out, tiny porcelain cups of crème brûlée, their caramel tops glistening under the chandelier. The Millers admired them with the same relish they gave every sign of refinement. Daniel lifted his spoon, but instead of cracking the sugar crust, he let it rest in his hand. His eyes swept the table once more. The voices around him blurred into one stream, a chorus of polished vowels and well-timed laughter. He had remained silent long enough. When the moment arrived, when glasses were raised for a final toast, when Richard cleared his throat to speak on behalf of family unity, Daniel placed his spoon down, straightened his jacket, and spoke. "Please," he said quietly but firmly, "may I say something?" The chatter softened. All eyes turned to him. David shifted uncomfortably, as if bracing for another stumble of accented words. Daniel reached into his worn leather bag, the one he had carried for decades, and laid a folder on the table. The snap of its clasp cut through the room like a hammer strike. He opened it slowly, revealing neatly stacked papers, ledgers, receipts, bank statements, documents yellowed at the edges from years of handling. Numbers marched across the pages in steady columns, more fluent than any sentence he had ever spoken in English. "These," Daniel began, his voice steady though the accent thickened, "are my words." He slid the first paper across the table toward Richard and Susan. 4 years at university, Daniel said, paid in full. Every semester, every book, every meal ticket. David graduate because of this. David's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Another paper. Daniel tapped it gently with his finger. "House," he said. "Down payment, 50,000. So you have this place to sit tonight." Emily's cheeks flushed. She stared at the tablecloth. Another paper. Daniel's eyes softened as he glanced at Mark. "Hospital bill," he said. "When Mark was sick, $17,000 paid in one day." Mark's face grew hot. He wanted to cry, but he swallowed hard instead. The room was silent now, the kind of silence no one could laugh away. Even the chandelier seemed to dim. Daniel folded his hands over the last page and looked around the table, his gaze steady, his voice low but unshakable. "All my life," he said, "my accent, my words, maybe not good enough, but numbers never lie. These numbers, they are my voice. They say I love my son, I protect my family, I build with my hands so you can live with comfort." He let the words sink in, then leaned closer, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. But tonight you laugh. You think accent means small man, weak man. He shook his head slowly. No, accent is only sound. What I do, that is my language. His hand pressed firmly on the stack of papers. And if this family cannot respect my voice, then this language stops here. No more checks, no more gifts. No more wood turned into gold. I keep it for myself or give to someone who see me, not laugh at me. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. For the first time that night, every face at the table was turned toward Daniel, not with amusement or pity, but with silence heavy enough to crack porcelain. Mark looked at his grandfather with wide, shining eyes, pride swelling in his chest. David sat frozen, his throat dry, the weight of unspoken gratitude pressing hard against his ribs. Emily stared at the untouched crème brûlée, her fork trembling slightly. Richard and Susan Miller had no clever retorts, no laughter left in them. Daniel closed the folder, slid it back into his bag, and leaned back in his chair. He lifted his spoon once more and cracked the caramel crust of his dessert. The sound was sharp, final, like the sealing of a truth. No one touched their dessert. The custards sat on the table, their caramel shells still unbroken, as though the sweetness had curdled under the weight of Daniel's words. Only Daniel had lifted his spoon. The sharp crack of caramel beneath his touch echoed like a gavel, declaring that judgment had already been passed. He ate slowly, calmly, his face unreadable. The rest of the table sat frozen, the air heavy with the shame no one dared name. At last, Richard cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle that came out brittle. Well, that's impressive, very impressive indeed, but surely, Daniel, you don't mean. Daniel set his spoon down gently but firmly. I mean every word. The tone of his voice silenced Richard instantly. There was no anger in it, no raised volume, only conviction. The kind that comes not from debate, but from a lifetime of proof. He leaned forward slightly, his hands folded over the folder of papers once more. His accent wrapped around each word, but this time no one dared to dismiss it. All these years, he said, I build, I pay, I give. I ask nothing back, not money, not thanks, only respect. His eyes shifted to David, and the younger man flinched. But tonight I see my son laugh when others laugh at me. That cut deeper than any word. David opened his mouth to speak, but Daniel raised a hand. The gesture was quiet but final. No excuses, Daniel said. You forget without these hands, without this voice you mock, this family sit nowhere. No school, no house, no food on this table. I give everything so you can stand tall, and still you think I am less. He paused, letting the silence grow dense. Then he drew in a steady breath, his eyes sweeping the table. So I make it clear, he continued. From tonight, no more. No more checks. No more mortgage payments. No more safety net. If you want to laugh, laugh without my money holding the roof above you. If you want to sneer, sneer without the food my labor put on this table. If my accent makes me small, then my money stays with me, or goes to someone who see me as I am. The chandelier flickered slightly, as though even the light strained under the weight of his words. Mark's chest rose and fell quickly. He had never seen his grandfather like this, so calm, so powerful. His eyes stung with unshed tears, pride mixing with sorrow in a way he couldn't quite name. Emily pressed her napkin to her lips, her hands trembling. She looked at her husband, but David kept his gaze fixed on the table, his face pale. The shame was too raw, too complete. Richard and Susan shifted uncomfortably, their earlier arrogance stripped bare. For once they had no clever dismissal. Numbers spoke louder than their polished English ever could, and the truth was undeniable. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his voice softening but not losing its edge. "Accent is only sound," he said. "It changed from country to country, but respect is same in every language, and tonight I see who speak it and who do not." He closed his folder with finality and placed it back into his bag. Then he lifted his glass of water, not wine, never wine, and held it steady. "To family," he said simply. No one raised their glass, not at first. Then slowly Mark lifted his. His small hand trembled, but his eyes were steady. "To family," he echoed, his voice clear in the heavy silence. Daniel's lips curved into the faintest smile. For him, that was enough. The silence stretched long after Daniel lowered his glass. It was not the silence of dismissal anymore. It was the silence of reckoning. For the first time that evening, Richard Miller looked uncertain. His usual confidence, polished from boardrooms and golf courses, seemed misplaced here, under the gaze of a man whose wealth wasn't measured in stocks but in sacrifice. He shifted in his chair, his throat tight. Susan's smile had faded entirely, leaving only a pale discomfort on her face. David sat motionless, his fork untouched, his eyes lowered. Inside, a storm churned. Shame burned hot in his chest, not for his father's accent, but for his own laughter. He remembered nights long ago when his father came home smelling of sawdust, his hands cracked and bleeding, yet still gentle when they tucked him into bed. He remembered a man who had never once said no to him. Now he had to face the truth. The same man he had taken for granted was the foundation beneath his entire life. "Dad," David's voice cracked. He tried again, softer. "Dad, Daniel lifted a hand. "Not tonight," he said quietly. His eyes were tired but steady. "Words now mean little. Show me tomorrow, next week, next year. Respect is not said. It is lived." David's throat closed around the reply he wanted to give. He could only nod, swallowing hard. At the other end of the table, Mark lifted his glass again. "To family," he repeated, stronger this time. His eyes never left his grandfather's. Something shifted in the room. Not a grand reconciliation, not a sweeping apology. Just a weight settling in the right place. The boy's voice had broken through where the adults could not. Daniel gave him a small nod, pride softening the lines of his face. That simple exchange, grandfather to grandson, was enough to remind him that his sacrifices had not vanished into silence. Someone had heard them, someone had understood. The rest of the dinner passed with little conversation. The Millers excused themselves early, their polished charm noticeably dimmed. Emily fussed with the dishes, her hands clumsy, her cheeks still flushed. David busied himself with clearing glasses, avoiding his father's eyes, but Mark lingered. When Daniel rose to leave, the boy slipped into the hallway and caught his sleeve. "Grandpa," he whispered, his voice small but fierce. "I'm proud of you." Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Then he placed a calloused hand on the boy's shoulder, squeezing gently. "One day you build your own numbers," he said. "Build them strong, but remember, strongest number is respect." Mark nodded, his throat tight. And with that, Daniel stepped into the night, his old sedan waiting at the curb. The air was cool, the stars sharp against the autumn sky. For the first time in years, his silence did not feel like weakness. It felt like dignity reclaimed. That night, as he drove home, Daniel thought of Anna. He imagined her beside him, smiling, her hand resting softly on his arm. He whispered into the dark, accent and all, "I did it, Anna, I spoke." The car hummed steadily down the quiet streets. Behind him, a family's shadows stretched long. Ahead of him, the road was open. Dear friends, thank you for joining us tonight on Family Shadows. This story, they mocked my accent at the family dinner, so I spoke in numbers they couldn't ignore, is a reminder that respect is a language spoken not in perfect words, but in actions, sacrifices, and love that endures even when unrecognized. If this story touched you, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, share these tales, and let them reach those who might need them. Until next time, I wish you health, peace, and a home filled with love and understanding. May your families be blessed, and may your shadows always remind you of the light behind them.